Have you ever heard of the play tape? It is an endless loop audio cartridge tape format aimed at the youth market that was briefly popular in the late 1960s. It's roughly similar in size to a cassette tape, but it looks much more similar to a downsized version of an 8-track, and that's because it basically is. Instead of 4 programs of music to choose from, like on the 8-track, you get 2 channels of music, and the open end of the cartridge that you stick into the machine looks very much like a miniaturized 8-track. The tape is half the width, but it has the same kind of pinch roller and slots for the heads to stick into, and underneath the tape the same kind of foam pads that usually disintegrate with age. And saying heads, plural, is correct because the play tape player actually has 2 of them, one for each track. And here is a play tape player amusingly called the Hipster. So if you're wondering how old that term is, it at least dates back to the late 1960s. So we can take one of these play tapes and stick it into the top of the player. And we get 2 different choices of music to listen to. Let's try the Beatles. Rather tinny and shrill sound. But that would have been similar to the AM radios kids were listening to back in the 60s. So I have 3 play tapes that work perfectly fine, but one here that doesn't. I get nothing on either channel. And if I take a closer look at them, it becomes obvious why, because one of the actually nicer features of a play tape compared to an 8-track is that the pinch roller is actually spring-loaded. If I push down on it, you can see it pops back up, except this one is stuck down and won't come back up, and that's why it won't play, because it's not making contact with the capstan in the tape player. I could try to fix it, but since I don't especially care for Bobby Goldsboro, I got the idea of what would happen if I took out this tape and put it in a cassette and tried to play it in a cassette player, because the tape is the same width as in a cassette. So would that work? The specifications of the cassette tape are well known and well documented, or at least you think so. For example, the speed of the tape is commonly cited as being 1 7/8 inches per second or 4.75 centimeters per second. But despite even Philips using those 2 numbers interchangeably, if you actually do the math to convert between English and metric, those 2 numbers are not exactly equal to each other. So even though there's only a very minor difference, there's actually some debate about which one is actually correct. But for now, I won't worry about that microscopic difference, and I'll just call it 1 7/8 inches per second. But as for the speed of the play tape, that's less well known. It's not mentioned at all in the Wikipedia article about the format, and I found several forum posts claiming that play tapes use the same 1 7/8 inches per second speed as cassettes, but that's wrong. Here's a Billboard article from October 1967 recapping a slideshow presentation given by play tape president Frank Stanton, in which it clearly states the speed of the play tape cartridge is 3 3/4 inches per second, the same as 4 and 8-track cartridges, and the reason for that is that this speed provides the best quality for the price. And here's the track layout of a cassette tape. On a stereo cassette, you get left and right tracks in each direction, and they're both 0.6 millimeters wide with a 0.3 millimeter gap between them. But if it's a mono tape, that would be a single 1.5 millimeter track in each direction, and the gap between the two directions is approximately 0.7 millimeters. And going back to that article about plate tape, it says track widths on the cartridge tape are 0.05 inches. Well, if you take that 1.5 millimeter track width of a mono cassette and convert it to English, you get 0.059 inches, which is pretty close. And it says the track spacing is 0.02 inches on the plate tape. Well, if you take that 0.7 millimeter track spacing of the cassette and convert that to English, you get 0.027 inches, which is also pretty close. So according to the official specs, if you took the tape out of a plate tape and re-spooled it into a cassette, the tracks would actually line up pretty well, but it would be playing at half speed. But you can easily work around that by using a cassette deck with high-speed dubbing, which will play the tape at twice the normal speed. So let's give it a try. There are several other videos about plate tape which are undoubtedly far superior to anything I could produce, but I don't think any of them actually cracked one of these open to show you what's inside. So here goes nothing. I'll try to split it apart at the seam, if I can get my tool in there. I don't know if there's like a screw in the middle. Is there? Oh, there's a little screw in the middle. So let me undo that. Okay, here's my screwdriver. See, I would not have known there was a screw in the middle without cracking this one open. So that should make it easier. And there it is. It really is just like a miniaturized 8-track. And here you can see why that spring-loaded pinch roller failed. The plastic cracked. Still a perfectly good pinch roller. Should keep that in case I need to fix one of the other play tapes. So I'll cut the tape here, right where it goes into the middle of the spool. And unfortunately this will probably cut it off in the middle of a song, but I'm not too concerned about that for this experiment because it's really just a proof of concept. And I just noticed that the arm of that spring-loaded pinch roller also acts as a brake to keep the tape from unspooling, so that's really cool. And I'll use one of these awful no-name Chinese blank tapes as a donor cassette to spool the plate tape into. So I'll cut off the leader and then discard the rest of this tape until I get to the leader at the other end of the tape. Here's a nice tape salad, just like you'd find on the side of the road 30 years ago. And here's the other leader, which I can cut off. And here I am ready to splice the plate tape onto the end of the cassette leader. But I've noticed that the plate tape is ever so slightly narrower than the cassette tape, so it doesn't get gripped in this splicing block like a cassette tape would. So that's something interesting. Nonetheless, I was able to splice it successfully, and I made sure to do the splice on the back side of the tape like you're supposed to. And to keep the tape from unraveling during the cross-format transfer, I temporarily reassembled both the plate tape and cassette shells. So now I just need to spend a few minutes doing this to move the tape across from the plate tape to the cassette. Actually, a better way to do it is to flip the whole thing over and then use one of these hand-cranked cassette rewinders, which should go a whole lot faster and more smoothly. And there, when I reached the end of the tape, it came off of the play tape and tucked itself into the cassette shell. So now I just need to splice the other end of it onto the other leader, then reassemble this completely. And there's the play tape completely transferred into the cassette shell. Not a perfect splice, I know, but again, this is just a proof of concept. And if you look closely, you can actually see the slight difference in width between the cassette tape leader and the play tape. Now if I take this play tape that was transplanted into a cassette shell and play in a standard cassette player, let's listen to what happens. It is playing, but it's playing at half speed, just like I expected. Here is a Technics RSB33W cassette deck from around 1985. It features Dolby B noise reduction, Dolby C noise reduction, and even DBX noise reduction. And more importantly for this video, it features 2 times speed high-speed dubbing. I'll put the transplanted play tape in the playback deck. I'll put a blank tape in the recording deck, engage high-speed dubbing mode, press record, and press play. And now I'll give you a direct hookup sample of what it sounds like. Yeah, I noticed it's playing mostly in the right channel. It must be due to the slightly different alignment of the play tape compared to a cassette.
I love you.
After a little bit of playing, the channel balance got better, I guess as this slightly narrower tape gradually centered itself, although it's still a bit louder in the right channel due to those minor differences in track alignment between the play tape and the cassette. And as for sound quality, there's not a lot of high-end treble response, but the bass response is very good, although it may have been intentionally boosted to try to improve the sound quality of these small portable players.
And honey, I miss you. And I'm being good.
And I should note that not all cassette decks have high-speed dubbing that is precisely calibrated to 2 times normal speed. For example, if I try it in this Emerson boombox, it sounds rather slow.
She wrecked the car and she was sad and so afraid that I'd be mad.
And some Pioneer decks have high-speed dubbing that is actually 1.6 times normal speed rather than 2 times normal speed. And I've noticed the more I've used this tape, the more this felt pressure pad has gotten stained. That's because the backside of the play tape is graphite coated, which is necessary in an endless loop design to allow the tape to more easily slip against itself as it's being pulled out from the center of the spool. The tape in an 8-track cartridge is exactly the same way. But unlike an 8-track, there is no foil sensing tape where the loop is joined. Play tape did not have the ability to automatically switch tracks. You have to do it manually with the switch. Now let's try flipping it over and playing the other side. It plays backwards, because whereas on a cassette the 2 sides play in opposite directions, because a play tape is an endless loop, both tracks play in the same direction. There are various ways to fix that, but especially if your goal is to digitize the audio anyway, the easiest is to record it into your computer and then reverse it using an audio editing application.
She tied me around her finger like a piece of twine. Then she dulled my senses with a glass of wine.
And yes, if you don't have a deck with high-speed dubbing, you can do the speed doubling on your computer as well. By now you're probably thinking it's not worth going through all this trouble just to listen to lo-fi mono recordings of 1960s pop music. And you're right, It's not. But the play tape format was also used by the Smith Corona mail call, a device for making voice letters in the era when long distance and especially international telephone calls were very expensive, and it was actually cheaper to make a tape recording and send it through the mail than to make a phone call. The mail call was a flop in the marketplace because reel-to-reel tape was already well established for that purpose, and cassette tapes were quickly gaining in popularity. But in case you ever come across any mail call letter pack cartridges, now you know how to transfer them. And it's definitely worth doing so because they may contain long-lost personal recordings from decades ago. And then in the 1970s, there was a variant of play tape in Japan called Hypack, which at first glance looks almost identical to a play tape, but it's actually even closer to a cassette than the play tape because it uses the same slightly wider tape as a cassette and the same track layout. It's also in stereo instead of mono, and most of the Hypack cartridges run at the same speed as cassette tapes. So if you take the tape out of a Hypack cartridge and re-spool it into a cassette, it should just play perfectly fine. The only thing you'll need to do is reverse the audio to play the other side.
Just the other woman, I don't count at all.
Michelle? Michelle?
What?
Put your headphones on.
Oh, I'm doing my work. I'm emceeing,
Are you
Erwin.
listening to this?
Hey,
This is wonderful.
didn't she remix this for the Beatles?
I suspect what happened was that they recorded this on quarter-track tape, which had something recorded in the other direction. And when they played it back, they probably sent it to the mastering lab when this record was made, and they accidentally played it on a half-track tape recorder, thus picking up the track going in the opposite direction. And they figured that this is the correct mix. And this is what they put on the record. This mistake wasn't made on the CD. This was made on the original release.
Now, if you play it the other way around, Erwin, it will say Paul Super Apple is dead. I buried Paul Super Apple.